The archive was silent, too silent. Dust floated in shafts of light, disturbed only by the careful turn of brittle pages. Amid forgotten maps and records, a solitary figure leaned over a creaking wooden table. His fingers hovered over the names, strange names stripped of home and voice. But Vincent Brown wasn't looking for facts. He was listening for ghosts. Long before he became a Harvard historian, Vincent was just a boy from Southern California, curious about what people weren't saying. In classrooms, textbooks mentioned slavery in passing, as if it had come and gone like a storm. But in Vincent's family, silence wrapped around the past like a shroud. He grew up sensing something deeper. Unspoken stories humming just beneath the surface. He found history not in triumphs, but in absences. Who gets remembered? Who decides what matters? These questions pulled him toward the margins, where stories lay buried, especially the stories of the enslaved. In graduate school, surrounded by books, he made a discovery. History was more than timelines. It was a battlefield of memory. Vincent didn't want to study slavery through numbers. He wanted to understand the people behind the statistics, the choices they made, the rebellions they launched, the dignity they preserved. To do that, he had to unlearn the way historians often wrote about Black lives, as if they were passive shadows. He believed the enslaved were never voiceless. They were silenced. In old ship logs, colonial letters, and trial transcripts, he saw more than data. He saw resistance. He saw whispers of revolt disguised in footnotes, strategy hidden in casual remarks, power in forgotten details. Vincent began to reconstruct the lives of the enslaved, not as victims of fate, but as strategists of survival. He treated their memories not as static facts, but as living signals. And in doing so, he challenged the very foundations of Western history. It was here, amid those archives, that Vincent Brown found his calling, to recover stories that had been deliberately buried. He didn't romanticize the past. He illuminated it. Flaws, fire, and all. He became the kind of historian who believed that the dead still had something to say, and that ignoring them wasn't just disrespectful, it was dangerous. But what exactly were they trying to warn us about? As Vincent dug deeper into the Black Atlantic, the violent crossing that chained millions from Africa to the Americas, he found more than suffering. He found rebellion, strategy, warnings wrapped in courage. The world had rewritten their resistance as invisibility, and he was determined to undo that silence. The past, he realized, was not a graveyard. It was a map, and Vincent Brown, the quiet man in the archive, was tracing a path others had tried to erase. But some maps don't just lead to buried truth. They lead to uncomfortable futures. And one revolt, long forgotten, was about to change everything he thought he knew. The rebellion that history forgot. 500 words. The name came to him like a whisper. Tacky. A rebel. A ghost. A leader whose story had been lost to the winds of empire. Vincent Brown first stumbled upon the name in a colonial report from 1760. The British governor of Jamaica had written it in haste, barely concealing the panic. An uprising had erupted among the enslaved. Farms were burning, plantations crumbling, lives, white and black, hanging in the balance. And at the center of the fire stood Tacky. Tacky wasn't just another enslaved man. He had once been a war leader in West Africa, a strategist, perhaps even royalty. Sold across the Atlantic like cargo, he landed in Jamaica, a living weapon forced into bondage. But chains couldn't erase his memory. In 1760, he led one of the most organized slave revolts the Western Hemisphere had ever seen. The more Vincent read, the more alarmed he became. Not at the violence, but at the silence that had followed it. How could a rebellion of such scale be so forgotten? The revolt stretched for months, with hundreds of enslaved Africans rising across the island, seizing weapons, cutting down slave owners, and briefly reclaiming land. The British were stunned. They responded with brutal force, hangings, beheadings, and terror. But the fear lingered. Brown saw what most historians had missed. This was no isolated incident. Tacky's revolt wasn't just a Jamaican rebellion. It was a battle in a global war. The enslaved weren't passive laborers. They were soldiers in a war for their own freedom. They brought with them knowledge of tactics, geography, and politics. The Atlantic Ocean wasn't a barrier. It was a battlefield. Vincent realized that history had framed enslaved people as static victims. But Tacky shattered that illusion. He wasn't begging for mercy. He was waging war. And yet, the official archives buried his story under the weight of imperial shame. The British chronicled their own heroism, their triumph over barbaric savages, and moved on. No monuments were built. No textbooks taught the names of the fallen rebels. Their memory was left to rot in neglected documents, invisible to the modern eye. Until Vincent Brown put the pieces back together. He mapped the revolt, literally. Using digital cartography, he retraced the steps of Tacky and his followers, showing how their movements mirrored the precision of a trained military campaign. It wasn't chaos. It was strategy. It wasn't madness. It was memory turned into action. But the deeper truth was more unsettling. If people could forget Tacky, if a war for freedom could vanish from public memory, what else had been erased? And worse, what if we were still repeating the same suppression under new disguises? Vincent Brown had found his lost rebellion, but its warning hadn't yet been heard. And in the echoes of Tacky's footsteps, another storm was brewing. The warning we refused to hear. 500 words. Vincent Brown stood before a lecture hall filled with bright screens and dull stares. Students clicked pens, scribbled notes, half listening. But Brown didn't raise his voice. He let the silence speak. On the screen behind him, a map, red lines tracing Tacky's revolt across Jamaica. Then beside it another image, Ferguson, Missouri. Tear gas, riot gear, raised hands. No words were necessary. Tacky's revolt, he said quietly, wasn't just about Jamaica. It was about control, and the way power responds to black defiance. That was the warning Vincent had come to see. Not buried in old archives, but pulsing in the present. The world hadn't forgotten the rebellion by accident. It had been erased on purpose, because it revealed a truth still too dangerous. When black people organize, when they resist, when they demand dignity, systems of power don't reform, they retaliate. History wasn't a chain of past events. It was a blueprint. Every slave ship, every whip crack, every rebellion crushed with overwhelming force. It echoed in the present. In every prison wall, every siren, every policy. Vincent didn't speak in slogans. He spoke in systems. He mapped connections between plantations and police forces, between colonial conquest and modern surveillance. He showed how power evolved, wearing new masks but wielding the same violence. And that's what frightened people. It wasn't just that Vincent told hard truths. It was that he made them undeniable. The enslaved had resisted, constantly, fiercely, but their resistance had been deleted, rewritten as disorder, their agency replaced with victimhood. And now, centuries later, a similar erasure was underway. Protesters were called looters. Movements were branded threats. Memory was under attack. Again, Brown argued that this pattern, revolt, retaliation, erasure, was not just historical. It was current. It was structural. And it was still claiming lives. He didn't preach despair. He taught vigilance. History is not just what happened, he said. It's what's allowed to be remembered. That, he believed, was the battleground. He urged his students, and anyone who would listen, to stop treating the past as a closed book, to question who wrote it, to ask what voices were silenced, to listen for what had been buried. And that listening, he insisted, was a kind of rebellion. Vincent's warning wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It sat quietly in the cracks between then and now, whispering of patterns we refuse to break. But even whispers, when heard clearly, can become thunder, because the war that Tacky fought wasn't over. It had changed uniforms, and Vincent Brown knew. If we failed to learn from the dead, we'd join them, marching blindly into the same fire they once tried to escape. The question wasn't if the past would repeat. The question was who would remember it in time. The warning we refused to hear. 500 words. Vincent Brown stood before a lecture hall filled with bright screens and dull stares. Students clicked pens, scribbled notes half listening. But Brown didn't raise his voice. He let the silence speak. On the screen behind